This powerful story reveals how race-based prejudices still lurk insidiously at the highest levels of corporate structures. The tension begins when a black CEO is denied access to a private jet, despite rightfully earning his position. What follows is a quiet resistance, a wave of collective solidarity, and ultimately a structural revolution. The right to equality is not just the tale of one man, but a gripping story of rebirth that portrays the struggle for existence within the corporate world by the unrepresented, the silenced, and the excluded. If you like the video and subscribe to the channel, let's move on to our story. Enjoy watching. As Midfield Executive Airport, on the border of Newark and Elizabeth, New Jersey, slowly stirred awake beneath a pale sunrise, a metallic chill settled over the terminal area. Despite it being late spring, a damp breeze drifting in from the Hudson River had formed a stealthy layer of mist across the runways. Just beyond the private jet apron, a black Range Rover came to a stop in the dimly lit VIP parking lot. As the engine cut off, a faint clicking sound and the scent of warm metal filled the air. The rear door opened slowly. Solomon Sol Hayes, CEO of Tri-Crown Dynamics, athletically built in his mid-40s with an upright stance, stepped onto the asphalt with deliberate strides. In the morning light, his dark skin took on a bronze hue, and his closely cropped hair glistened with beads of sweat. Instead of a dress shirt, he wore a fine open-collar wool sweater beneath a charcoal gray high-collared cashmere coat. His suit jacket had been packed away for comfort during the flight. In his left hand he held a quilted leather briefcase and in his right, a glossy blue boarding pass. Printed in bold letters, "Passenger of Record, Solomon Hayes." Below that the aircraft's tail number was clearly visible, N987TC. From the driver's seat emerged Lori Finch, a slim woman in gray slacks, the living embodiment of precision who had spent most of her life assisting the man she now followed. She opened the trunk and pulled out a sleek, minimalist suitcase. Its wheels rolled silently, and a small metal plaque bearing the initials SH shimmered near the handle. Lori quickened her pace to catch up to her boss. As they approached the glass doors of the terminal, the automatic sensors responded with a delay. The door hesitated like a guest reluctant to open up. Sol paused involuntarily and caught his reflection in the glass. The face staring back was stern. Faint purple circles from late-night presentation prep lined the corners of his eyes. But Sol barely glanced at the image, years of self-assurance reloaded into his stride as he entered. At the VIP reception desk stood a young staff member in a navy blue uniform, her hair pulled tightly into a bun. A security officer in a similar color palette, broad-shouldered and imposing, approached them. The expected polite smile had been replaced by stiff formality. Before Sol could say a word, the guard raised an electronic tablet, swiped once across the screen and began. "Good morning, sir. Your flight is scheduled to depart in 45 minutes. May I see your ID and invitation code, please?" Sol handed over his boarding pass and waited silently. The guard scanned the barcode, glanced at the screen, then narrowed his eyes and looked again. A faint furrow formed on his brow. "You're not showing up in the system. There may be some mistake." The words echoed under the terminal's high ceiling like an off-script line from a play. Sol had passed through these kinds of lounges for over a decade, his name typically topping the lists. "There's no mistake," he replied, calm but with a trembling patience. "I personally confirmed the reservation last night. Our finance department already wired the flight cost to your account." Lori immediately pulled out Sol's passport, the emailed confirmation and the payment receipt. But what caught the eye in that moment was the reflection behind the staff member. On the lounge's glass wall, a group of 4 white men in expensive suits were laughing, their voices mingling with the aroma of freshly brewed Guatemalan coffee. Soon to depart for the New Orleans Investment Summit, they seemed oblivious to the disruption. The officer leaned into his radio and mumbled something in a low voice. A faint 10-4 confirmation crackled back. He turned to Sol. "Sir, your file has a note for additional security screening. You'll need to be temporarily redirected to the waiting area before boarding." The words froze Sol in place like a glacier burrowing into his spine. A CEO's greatest fear is realizing his authority only exists on paper, because everything signed can dissolve in the mist called procedure. Lori inhaled sharply but said nothing. She knew the best move was to follow her boss's lead. Sol stepped back slightly, trying not to escalate the scene. He could feel his fingernails biting into his palms. The opening keynote he was to give at the Delacroix Summit in New Orleans echoed in his head. Diversity and inclusion are the spark of innovation. Was it irony? That in the heart of an industry that claimed to be inclusive, he was now being locked out in the early morning haze? For a fleeting moment, he considered walking away and calling a private helicopter. But that thought was quickly shoved back into the darkest shelf of his mind. This wasn't about transportation anymore. It was about the invisible wall being built in plain sight. Two passengers walking by with their phones slowed as they noticed Soul. One discreetly started recording. The short video was enough. Within minutes, the clip surfaced on X, formerly Twitter, with the hashtag #LetSoulBoard. The algorithm quickly elevated the incident, an elite black CEO being denied boarding, as a trending topic. As a pale beam of sunlight trickled through the terminal's high glass windows, a shorter man from the investor group, likely the team leader, gestured to the pilot through the window with a "let's go" signal. Captain Ruiz gave a subtle nod, tipping his cap. According to the shift schedule, they weren't waiting for final fueling. Everything was ready. Everything except the CEO. Soul took a deep breath, pulled out his phone, and dialed the internal line to reach Carl Everett. "Carl, this feels like a nightmare. I've been removed from the list. Handle it, now." Carl's hesitation seeped through the speaker. "Soul, I had no idea. I'm mobilizing PR and security immediately." As the minutes passed, the murmurs in the terminal grew louder. Two airport officials in uniform arrived, exchanging glances, quietly debating the reason. None of them could say aloud. Soul bit his lip, trying to silence a flood of memories. The day he was locked in the locker room during middle school basketball tryouts. The quiet exclusion in his first class at Harvard. Being reduced to just the technical co-founder, during a pitch in Silicon Valley. And today, it all came down to one bureaucratic phrase at this terminal: "You're not in the system." But Hayes didn't break. He pulled a small bar stool from beside a side table and placed it directly across from the VIP gate. Sitting down, he unfastened his coat buttons and folded his arms. Lori rolled the suitcase to the side and stood next to him. Soul, in a steady tone, said, "I'm not leaving. I'll wait until my name appears on that list." As curious eyes turned toward them and cameras clicked on, soft jazz music still played from the terminal speakers, but the rhythm now clashed with the rising pulse of the crowd. The guard glanced at his radio and took a step forward, then hesitated. He was the only one technically enforcing the rules, but he wasn't just facing a CEO anymore. He was facing a whole erased identity. Soul turned on his phone's front camera and went live. As the morning sun rose behind him, his voice, calm enough to raise goosebumps, reached millions. "This isn't just my flight. This is the flight of anyone who's ever had to ask who deserves a seat, a door, a threshold. And I will cross that threshold today." When he finished speaking, a new silence swept over the terminal. The wind tapped the glass despite the ongoing noise from the tarmac. The plane's propeller heaters spun up, the metal hum echoing like Soul's heartbeat, fast, steady, unstoppable. No one noticed at first, but viewer numbers on the live stream were soaring. A message popped up from a New York Times reporter, "Available for a live interview?" A CNBC producer was already in the queue. As social media erupted in real time, the small space where Hayes sat had transformed into the loudest echo chamber in corporate America. And so, the metal turnstile before the VIP gate was about to become a monumental turning point in corporate history. The first spark had been lit, and its smoke was already rising into the sky. Inside the midfield executive terminal, time seemed to slow. Though the clock read 7:12 a.m., the atmosphere carried the weight of a gloomy afternoon. Solomon Hayes sat upright on a black bar stool, his eyes fixed on the frosted glass doors of the VIP lounge. His phone, resting on the low table in front of him, was still broadcasting live. The camera showed his strong but weary face. There were signs of sleeplessness in his eyes, yet a storm of determination raged inside him. Today he would not back down. The staff had given up trying to persuade him and had scattered to different corners of the terminal. The security personnel stood nearby, ostensibly to maintain order, but none of them seemed to know exactly what they were supposed to do. Hayes's silent yet composed posture had become an uncomfortable mirror for everyone around. A black CEO, fully aware he was being systematically excluded, was not lashing out, not shouting, but simply remaining. And somehow that made him feel like an even greater threat. Standing behind Sol, Lori Finch checked the stream of incoming notifications, her brows furrowed in anger at the company's continued silence. On her screen, media interest was rapidly escalating. NBC, The Guardian US, Bloomberg Tech, all had picked up the story. One of the most striking lines came from The Atlantic's reporter. A CEO's seat of power is the decision-making table of his company. But today that table seems to have been moved outside behind a turnstile. Hayes didn't speak much on the live stream, just brief updates when necessary. At one point he leaned toward the mic and said, "No one is waiting here with me right now. But many are watching. And it's the people who refuse to just watch who change the world." His words echoed across social media. Posts under the hashtag #LetSolBoard multiplied. Some users shared clips from Hayes' past speeches. Others quoted his Stanford commencement address. One line in particular was retweeted thousands of times. "Standing silently before the doors you've been excluded from is also a protest. But only if you don't look away." Further down the runway, the Gulfstream G650 still sat prepared for departure. The tail number N987TC gleamed under the morning sun. Inside, the investor group had at first remained silent about the missing CEO, but unease was spreading. Brett Callahan, the portfolio manager, walked to the cockpit and asked, "Why haven't we taken off yet?" Captain Ruiz tried to maintain composure. "Legally, the passenger manifest must be finalized and closed with a signature. Solomon Hayes is listed. I've received no instruction to amend the flight record." Callahan grumbled and returned to the cabin, exchanging messages with key figures inside the company. Most notable was a reply from Grant Wexley, the firm's strategic advisor. His message was curt and cold. "We can afford to cut him loose. Let's take off before this turns into a bigger mess." But that cut him loose strategy underestimated the power of social momentum. If the jet departed, it would brand the company as one that turns a blind eye to corporate racism. Hayes' quiet resistance was unraveling their entire plan. In one corner of the terminal, news crews were setting up. CBS News arrived first. Then came the local NJ Spotlight team, taking position outside with a 3-person crew. Inside, a reporter approached Hayes and held out a microphone. "Mr. Hayes, would you call this an example of corporate discrimination?" Sol answered without looking away. "I'm not sitting here as an individual. I'm sitting here representing millions. This isn't just my ticket, this is the ticket to equality. And today it's been denied." After those words, a hush fell over the terminal. Staff members whispered among themselves. Some passengers kept secretly recording videos. Others couldn't even bring themselves to meet his gaze. A stir in the boardroom. In Manhattan, the 37th floor of Tri-Crown Dynamics headquarters was preparing for an emergency meeting. With the CEO absent, acting President Carl Everett stared nervously at the monitors. The company's communications director, Jason Weller, spoke in a tense voice. "This footage is spreading, Carl. We're already seeing a 1.4% dip in stock, and it's barely morning. Draft a statement before this PR crisis explodes," Everett said. "But keep it controlled. Emphasize that there was no breach of company protocol." That sentence revealed the true battleground of Sol's fight. Discrimination worth millions, hidden behind the thin veil of procedural paperwork. And Sol was confronting it, not with one soundbite but with an unwavering stance. The man who wasn't allowed to board but refused to step back. Ace checked the time on his watch. According to the flight plan, only 14 minutes remained until takeoff. The jet's engine started once, then cut off. A refueling truck arrived but no service was performed. Clearly, internal divisions were surfacing on board. Just then Lori looked up from her phone. "Sol, Harmony Capital just called. They said if this doesn't get resolved, they'll be re-evaluating their stake." That sparked something in Sol's eyes. Harmony Capital owned 9% of the company, enough to sway the boardroom's fate. And that spark was no longer just a spark. It was becoming a fire. Amid the rising glass towers of New York, the Tri-Crown Dynamics headquarters shimmered under the morning sun. Yet inside, the atmosphere was glacial. On the 37th floor, in the executive boardroom, thick curtains were drawn and the lights dimmed. Amid screens, phones, and half-finished cups of coffee, a silent crisis was unfolding. What had started with CEO Solomon Hayes being denied boarding at Midfield Executive Airport had now grown large enough to shake the steel beams of the building. Carl Everett, acting as interim chairman, wore the role uneasily. His face showed not authority but uncertainty. Across the room, Communications Director Jason Weller activated the white wall crisis display. CNN, MSNBC, Bloomberg, even TMZ were all airing headlines of Seoul's protest at the terminal. The man who couldn't board is now shaking Wall Street. CNN. CEO denied, company silent. How long will the silence last? Box. Weller lowered his voice. In the last 45 minutes, over 12,000 tweets have targeted our company. Not just from the US, we're getting traction in London, Berlin, and Lagos. The hashtag has gone global. Carl pressed his lips together, the wrinkles on his forehead deepening as he squinted. This was a crisis of a scale he had never anticipated. For him, Solomon missing his morning flight may have started as a personal mishap, but now it had become a global message. Among the board members, the most vocal was Grant Wexley, the company's strategic advisor. Adjusting the collar of his navy suit, he began. We call this a crisis, but at its core it's a simple procedural error. What Seoul experienced is being painted as something outside corporate policy. If we defend this, we risk turning the company into an ideological battleground. What's ideological? CFO Rebecca Monroe interrupted, her voice cold but clear, is that the CEO's name was missing from the manifest. Even if it was human error, when only white passengers board without issue, it stops being procedure and becomes a problem. Grant shot her a dismissive glance. Seoul's playing the victim. He's choosing his words carefully on live stream, but the message is clear. He's accusing us of racism and cornering us. This is unsustainable. At that moment the door opened. A secretary leaned in and handed Carl an envelope. Inside was an official notice from Harmony Capital. Until clarity is established regarding your approach to corporate equity, we are re-evaluating our investment position. In a moment of such public scrutiny, placing full responsibility on the CEO alone would be inconsistent with principles of ethical governance. The words cut through the room like ice. Harmony held over 9% of the company's stock and had played a key role in Seoul's appointment. Their shifting stance could fracture Tri-Crown's corporate identity. At that moment, company legal counsel Nora Beach threw a folder onto the table. Seoul submitted a note to the flight department at 6 a.m. His name was in the system, but someone manually added a secondary security screening tag. This was an internal override. You're saying someone deliberately prevented the CEO from boarding? Carl asked. Yes, Nora confirmed. And there's no log entry for the override. Someone inside the company wanted to stop Seoul from taking that flight. Wexley stood abruptly. We don't need conspiracy theories. The media storm Seoul's stirring up is overblown. Let him take another jet and move on with his job. But Monroe's patience snapped. He's doing his job, Grant. Protecting the company's reputation, its stock value, and employee trust. He was held up in that terminal for one reason, his skin color. You might call that a small procedure, but to us it's a crisis of trust. Just then, a new data feed from the company's internal network silenced the room. Tri-Crown employees had started a thread on the internal messaging platform titled #SolidWithSeoul. Out of 480 employees, 312 had posted open support. If our CEO can't move forward, neither will we. I've canceled all my morning meetings. There's no innovation without equity. Silence is a choice. We choose to speak. Rebecca Monroe turned to Carl. This isn't just Seoul's flight. It's the company's direction. Either we face this head-on and respond, or Seoul walks away. And when he does, he'll take the conscience of the public with him. Carl lowered his gaze. What do you suggest? Go to the terminal. Speak with him directly. Carl nodded slightly. But his eyes still showed hesitation. Because this wasn't just about Seoul. It was about a structural fracture embedded deep within the company's soul. If no decision was made today, the only thing holding the building up tomorrow would be its steel beams, because they'd have lost the people inside. The elevator doors opened. Carl Everett put on his jacket and stepped out. At the same time, on the 19th floor of the Tri-Crown Tower, Human Resources, protests were beginning to stir. And through it all, Seoul still sat on that same stool. With the same resolve. In the same silence. Only now that silence no longer belonged to him alone. As the storm clouds over the terminal drifted toward Tri-Crown Dynamics' executive floor in Manhattan, the pressure inside the crisis room reached a boiling point. Acting Chair Carl Everett and Strategy Advisor Grant Wexley huddled behind closed steel-framed curtains, drafting a new damage control plan. But this time it went far beyond defending a flawed procedure. It aimed to discredit Sol Hayes. The first step appeared as an internal memo. Signed by Wexley, the note didn't name Sol directly, but referred to leaders demonstrating cultural misalignment, who could be subjected to controlled isolation during times of crisis. The phrase cultural misalignment was bolded and underlined. Anyone fluent in corporate code understood. This meant skin color. The stench of passive racism floated through the ventilation system. When CFO Rebecca Monroe saw the memo, she frowned. If this is published, it'll torch our reputation along with our financials. Wexley shrugged, offering a cutting smile. Sometimes deep cleaning calls for strong chemicals. That strong chemical grew even more corrosive minutes later with a second wave HR email. Sol's company email access was temporarily suspended. The reason? Security review. The head of IT hesitated to carry out the order, but Wexley raised his hand. I authorized it. If a CEO becomes a media threat to the company, access restriction is legitimate. And just like that, Sol had been locked out of his digital office too. 9:06 a.m. at Midfield Executive Airport. Sol was still on his bar stool, but now no longer alone. 4 young Tri-Crown engineers had taken a taxi from Newark and arrived at the terminal, wearing company-branded fleeces and holding cardboard signs. Code runs on equality. Diversity equals innovation superscript 2. Security erected a barrier to keep them out of the private passenger zone. One engineer called out to Sol. Boss, we're not giving up. We've got your back. Applause erupted in the terminal. Cameras turned. Viewers watched the moment unfold live. The hashtag had surpassed 4.6 million posts. Back in Manhattan, Wexley drafted a press release branding Sol as a leader inciting unlawful protest among radicalized employees. The statement was laced with carefully coded racial language. High-octane calls drowning out reasonable voices. An agenda misaligned with company culture. Urban methods disrupting operations. Monroe let out a cold laugh as she read the draft. Urban? That's the diplomatic way of saying, he's a problem because he's black. Even with this thin layer of diplomacy, a sealed envelope landed on the CFO's desk. Harmony Capital had submitted a second statement. If any official communication includes racially charged subtext, we will immediately liquidate our position. Carl Everett rubbed the vein pulsing in his temple. The threat from shareholders now carried irreversible consequences. 9:23 a.m. The terminal doors slid open. A young man entered, wheeling a leather case behind him. It was Sol's attorney, Elijah Briggs. The wheels of his case squeaked over the polished floor, like justice announcing its arrival. Briggs knelt beside Sol and quietly opened his folder. His words cut into the live stream. Under FAA Regulation 455B and the 14th Amendment, we have grounds to declare arbitrary discrimination. I'm filing for immediate flight injunction and opening a federal inquiry. A nearby agent grabbed his radio. The airport's legal unit panicked. The plane doors were closed, but even remaining on the runway was now a liability. A federal block order could land at any moment. At Tri-Crown HQ, a red warning flashed across the central monitor. CC alert, federal inquiry pending. Wexley's face turned pale. This time the CFO spoke first. Grant, while you were trying to whitewash racism on paper, you've put us at risk of a federal lawsuit. Wexley growled. Force Sol to resign. End of problem. No, Monroe said. This ends when you and those who think like you resign. Suddenly the door burst open. HR Director Diane Tran entered, waving a printed report. 61% of employees have cut access to production systems today under Solidarity Slowdown. Europe and APAC offices too. Code is freezing globally. Everett sank into his chair. On one side, Harmony was threatening liquidation. On the other, global productivity had halted. The company was minutes away from a billion-dollar loss. Back at the terminal, Sol launched another live stream with his attorney by his side. His voice carried unwavering resolve. There are people right now trying to silence me. Let me be clear, I'm not just trying to board a plane. I'm trying to open every door that's been shut in our faces for years. And if I must, I'll open each one, like I'm dragging this case behind me. In the background, Briggs zipped the folder shut and slid it into the case. The pen clicked, the documents were sealed. The wheels squeaked once more, justice in motion. In Manhattan, Wexley stared at the screens. As the stock price dropped cents by the second, the CFO's voice turned steely. If you formalize that memo, Grant, you won't just lose shares, you'll lose your freedom. Federal anti-discrimination laws apply to you too. Wexley's lip twitched. He slowly pulled his hands off the table. Everett, trembling, picked up the phone and dialed the terminal. Sol, we need to talk. Sol's face appeared on screen. His eyes were tired but burning. Better late than never, Carl. But know this time I'm building the table. The jet still sat idle on the tarmac, its engines cold. The employee protest had spread across the global network. The federal investigation papers were in motion. The leadership's racial maneuvering had been laid bare. And as Sol rolled his briefcase like a bell tolling at every threshold, Tri-Crown's fate hung by a thread. And when that thread snaps, who will fall? 11:07 a.m. On the screens of the New York Stock Exchange, Tri-Crown Dynamics, TRCD, suddenly flashes red. Hourly trading volume spikes to abnormal levels. At first, analysts assume a technical glitch, but the reality soon becomes clear. The Federal Civil Equality Division (Fed) has accepted the filing submitted earlier that morning by Sol Hayes' attorney and has launched a preliminary investigation. The headlines drop all at once. Was Tri-Crown CEO the target of discrimination? Fed launches probe into Tri-Crown. Investors flee as protests escalate. This isn't just a news story, it's a tectonic rupture, exposing fault lines that have been buried for years within Tri-Crown's internal structure. On the 37th floor of Tri-Crown's Manhattan headquarters, normally a space where only whispers are heard, phones are ringing off the hook, voices echo from every room. Carl Everett is locked in a tense meeting with CFO Rebecca Monroe, HR Director Diane Tran, Legal Counsel Nora Beach, and a still-seated Grant Wexley, the embattled strategy advisor. Rebecca slams her palm on the table. The stock is down 9%, Carl. And it's only morning. If the SEC and Fed both open investigations, every internal memo you've kept hidden for 3 years will be scrutinized. Grant jumps to defend himself. Hayes is sabotaging us. This whole plane issue was a minor misunderstanding. He turned it into a public spectacle. Nora Beach opens a folder and slides it across the table. No, Grant. The plane incident was triggered internally. And internal emails have surfaced. Messages labeling the CEO as a cultural misfit, laced with racially coded language. Many of them bear your signature. Grant's face turns ashen. A silence falls over the room. Just then the door opens. The Director of Investor Relations steps in. Harmony Capital, Avia Trust, and Stonebridge have issued a joint ultimatum. If an internal investigation isn't launched by end of day, they'll pull all holdings from Tri-Crown. Monroe closes her eyes. That's a $14 billion pullout. New front line at the terminal. Back at Midfield Executive Terminal, Sol is still sitting on the same stool. But now more than a dozen supporters surround him. 3 young employees kneel just behind him, joining in silent protest. Handwritten signs speak volumes with their simplicity. This isn't about a ticket. It's about who's allowed at the table. While attorney Elijah Briggs is on the phone with federal representatives, Sol gives a brief but powerful statement. This isn't about a boarding pass. It's about assumptions of what a leader should look like. This fight isn't for me. It's for everyone who comes after me. CNN is broadcasting live. The anchor doesn't interrupt. Sol's voice spreads across homes, offices, and campuses nationwide. At that moment, a new message lands in Tri-Crown's internal network. Subject line. Time to recode the system. Message body. The treatment of Sol is unacceptable. Upholding diversity and justice isn't just a value, it's a responsibility. The message is sent to 6,000 employees in 19 countries. Within 10 minutes, 3,800 respond. I agree. I'm joining the walkout. 12:14 p.m. Production infrastructure slows down. Code freeze begins across systems. CRM platforms switch to maintenance mode. Internal software teams restrict external data access. A quiet digital rebellion is underway. At the same time, Carl Everett arrives at the terminal. He steps off a company jet and enters under security escort. His eyes lock with Sol's, still seated, unmoved. Carl walks over. Sol doesn't stand. It isn't disrespect. It's a statement. A stance. Carl speaks. Sol, I never wanted it to come to this. Neither did I, Carl. But it always comes to this, for us. This time someone just stopped. The company is bleeding. Sol smiles faintly. You're watching the stock price. I'm watching the corporate soul. What do you want? Transparency. An apology. And structural reform. Carl pauses for a few seconds, then lowers his head. I'll call a board meeting tomorrow morning. We'll put everything on the table. No, Sol replies. I'll call the meeting. Because no one silences me anymore. That same afternoon, the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice issue a joint statement. Allegations of systemic discriminatory practices within Tri-Crown Dynamics will be formally investigated. The announcement sends a shockwave through the financial world. What began with one man sitting on a stool is now etched into corporate America's timeline as a historic turning point. By day's end, the company's stock has dropped 13%. The first board resignation arrives. Grant Wexley steps down. Employees spend the night in camping chairs at the terminal in a show of continued solidarity. For the first time in Tri-Crown Dynamics history, a board meeting was not being held at its Manhattan headquarters, but at the Midfield Executive Terminal in New Jersey. The VIP lounge, normally a quiet backdrop for private departures, had become the stage for something else entirely, a corporate reckoning born from a silent protest. One by one, the company's senior executives entered the room. Among them were CFO Rebecca Monroe, HR Director Diane Tran, Legal Counsel Nora Beach, Cybersecurity Chief Martin Shaw, and the vacant chair of recently ousted Strategy Advisor Grant Wexley. But all attention was focused on the most unusual figure in the room, Solomon Hayes, dressed in a black turtleneck and gray wool blazer, standing silently with a folder of documents in his hand. The boardroom table was circular this time. No company emblem sat atop it. Sol spoke first. His voice wasn't angry nor conciliatory, just firm, measured, clear. Today marks a breaking point in this company's history. We are no longer just talking about crisis response, we're talking about who we are. Carl Everett exhaled and took the floor. Sol, I need you to understand, this situation has been devastating for the company's image. Shareholders are under pressure, investors are pulling out. Yes, mistakes were made, but this wasn't some conspiracy to keep you off a plane. Carl, Sol interrupted, it wasn't a person who kept me off that plane. It was a system. And parts of that system are sitting in this room. Sol's gaze moved around the table. No one could look away. The weight in his posture didn't just come from what had happened, but from the truth earned through every quiet minute he sat in that terminal. His attorney, Elijah Briggs, placed documents on the table. Erased flight records from the system. Log files showing the manual addition of a security tag. Internal messages from Grant Wexley, Hayes is making too much noise. Delay his VIP protocol. Comments from employees laced with racial undertones. His posture is too defiant. The board doesn't respond well to that tone. Nora Beach confirmed. These aren't just technical errors or personal judgments. This was a structural plan to marginalize and discredit. A heavy silence fell. Sol spoke again. I didn't come to this company just to manage it. I came to transform it. But we've built a system here where appearance overrides insight, success is met with suspicion, and leadership is treated as a privilege to be granted. In the second half of the session, Sol presented a reform package, laying out 3 proposals under the title: Corporate Equity and Representation Charter, Board Diversity Quota, Mandated Ethnic and Cultural Representation at the board level, Anti-Discrimination Digital Oversight System, Transparent, trackable logs of all internal decisions, Employee Rights Council, Elected employee representatives with participatory governance powers. Carl narrowed his eyes and asked, "And what about you? What do you want?" Sol lifted his head. Not power. Assurance. So that no one who sits at this table will ever again have to defend their right to be here. The first to object was cybersecurity chief Martin Shaw. This system would paralyze internal operations. If every decision is tracked, how can managers act freely? Freedom shouldn't be mistaken for the freedom to exclude, Stool replied. This system doesn't restrict you. It protects those who've been pushed to the margins. Diane Tran spoke up. I speak for the employees. If this passes, it finally means being heard. Rebecca Monroe nodded slowly. For the first time, we're staring at a real vision. Not a market strategy, but a human strategy. It was time to vote. Each executive pressed their button. A screen lit up. Yes, 6. No, 1. Abstain, 0. The package had passed. All eyes turned to Carl. He was among the yes votes, but the tension still lingered on his face. Stool, not looking away from the screen, said, Today we didn't just decide what this company is, we chose what it wants to become. This isn't the end. This is day one. As the meeting adjourned, they looked through the terminal's glass windows. Outside, employees, journalists, and supporters were still gathered. Stool walked toward the doors, step by step, holding the final signed document in hand. The charter was now official. When the door opened, applause from inside blended with cheers from outside. Stool looked up, the sky was clear. In the background, the Gulfstream jet still sat waiting. But now that wait meant something new. That flight was no longer just bound for New Orleans. It was bound for the future. For the first time in Tri-Crown Dynamics history, a CEO wasn't just leading the company through executive authority, but through shareholder power. Just 2 days after his victory at Midfield Executive Terminal, Solomon Hayes re-emerged, this time on a different path, taking control of the financial trajectory. Early that morning, unusual activity was reported on Wall Street. By 9 a.m., New York-based investment firm Brightwood Strategies announced it had acquired a 7.4% stake in Tri-Crown Dynamics. But what shocked the markets was on whose behalf the purchase had been made. Brightwood Strategies is acting on behalf of independent investor Solomon Hayes. The news hit the financial world like a bombshell. Stool was no longer just the CEO. He had become one of the largest individual shareholders. With this stake, he now held blocking power in key board votes. His influence no longer came solely from a corporate title, it came from ownership. The move sent waves of uncertainty through investor circles. Some called it a bold display of power. Others claimed Hayes had conquered the company from within. But Stool's plan was more strategic than anyone had guessed. His first public statement was as simple and measured as ever. I'm not just managing this company. I own part of it. My voice isn't protected by title alone, but by stake. This fight is about the company's future. But more importantly, it's about who the company belongs to. Back in the top floor boardroom, tension returned. CFO Rebecca Monroe appeared cautiously optimistic. Stool becoming a shareholder strengthens his leadership. It makes investors feel like they're in the same boat as the captain. But acting chairman Carl Everett saw it differently. To him, Stool's rise was beginning to feel like a silent coup. There's a difference between leading the company and crowning yourself its savior, he said. Hayes isn't saving Tri-Crown, he's using it as a platform for his own story. Stool only smiled when he heard this. Maybe the problem is, Carl, you've never lived that story the way I have. Stool's first formal act as shareholder was to register the company's new equity charter with the SEC. The filing included policies such as increasing cultural and ethnic diversity in leadership roles by 20%, implementing a real-time digital discrimination monitoring system, allowing elected employee observers to attend board meetings annually. The filing initially caused a minor drop in stock price, typical market uncertainty response. But by the afternoon, the tide shifted. Harmony Capital announced it was reversing its withdrawal. Their statement read, Hayes' dual role as leader and investor strengthens Tri-Crown's vision for consistency and transparency. A promising new era begins. Shortly after, Avia Trust and Stonebridge followed suit. Within 24 hours, Tri-Crown stock had risen 11%. As the dust from Grant Wexley's exit began to settle, another voice emerged from within leadership. Head of Digital Operations Neil Kravitz posted a statement on the company's internal forum, arguing that mandated racial and cultural representation could dilute executive quality. Stool didn't respond. But the employees did. Representation is not weakness. It's balance. Leadership quality comes from multiplicity, not homogeneity. We're not silent anymore. The post garnered thousands of responses. Kravitz resigned within 2 days. From Wall Street to civil society. Sol's shareholder power had become more than a financial tactic. It was a symbol. In universities, boardrooms, and activist circles, the Hayes model began gaining traction. When your CEO is also your investor, the seat isn't just a title, it's a responsibility. Can conscience be a measurable asset in corporate leadership? CNBC aired a special segment. Sol Hayes, Resistance by Stock. And perhaps the most poignant comment came from the black founder of a mid-sized tech company. Hayes didn't just bring his voice to the table, he brought voting power. No one can mute that. The plane still waits. At Midfield Terminal, the Gulfstream G650 was still parked. Its flight had once again been delayed, not for technical reasons but as a symbolic choice. Sol still hadn't boarded. His assistant, Lori Finch, asked, "Are we flying now?" Sol replied calmly, "Not yet. First, I need to make sure everyone has a boarding pass." 3 months had passed. Tri-Crown Dynamics had not only grown by 17% compared to the same period the previous year, but also, for the first time, achieved a high ethical compliance rating in the Corporate Sustainability Index. But the most meaningful transformation hadn't occurred on the balance sheets. It had happened at the heart of the company. Now, Solomon Hayes was preparing to speak inside the glass hall atop Tri-Crown's New York headquarters. This was the company's first General Assembly under its new corporate charter. Over 300 attendees, investors, employee delegates, and media representatives, watched silently. Behind Sol, a projector screen displayed 3 words: representation, justice. He placed his hands on the podium. His voice was firm and clear, powerful but never threatening. 3 months ago, I was denied entry through a door. Boarding pass on my wrist, company ID in hand, but nothing behind me but isolation. That day, I learned that no matter how much you achieve, the system can still treat you like an outsider. But I also learned this: resistance isn't just about raising your voice. It's about sitting and waiting, calmly, until that door opens. And now it has. And it will never close again. Then Sol introduced the new Corporate Equity and Access Charter. No longer a proposal, this was now a registered and enforceable framework. The board must consist of at least 30% members from diverse ethnic and cultural backgrounds. All C-suite appointments, including the CEO, must be approved through an independent equity commission. Every employee will participate in an annual corporate inclusivity assessment. Departments found engaging in discriminatory behavior will face salary deductions, bonus cancellations, and mandatory public reporting. These provisions had been officially registered with the SEC. They could not be undone. The silence in the hall was full of reverence. Sol concluded, "This is no longer a matter of leadership. It is the answer to who we are, and who we are here for." At the first employee forum of the new era, the microphone passed into the hands of those who had long stood in the background. Chinelo Iwobi, a Nigerian software engineer, delivered her first presentation at a product strategy meeting. Marcos Ortega, a Latin American warehouse manager, was elected as an employee representative. Jihyun Pak, an Asian financial analyst, took a seat as an observer on the board. For them, this wasn't just an opportunity. It was proof that the system had finally learned how to see them. Among corporate investors, change was equally visible. Harmony Capital, Avia Trust, and Stonebridge each announced that they would model parts of their own internal governance reforms on Tri-Crown's example. The Wall Street Journal ran a headline that read, "Sol Hayes didn't just survive an executive crisis. He turned shareholder power into a principle of justice." Most investors were no longer seeking only profit, but value-based leadership. Even months later, Midfield Executive Terminal remained vivid in the public consciousness. On the morning of July 6, the anniversary of the crisis, Sol returned to the terminal. No press. No crowds. Just a gray suit, a quiet assistant. And the same Gulfstream G650 still waiting. This time no one stopped him. The doors opened automatically. The attendant made eye contact and nodded. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Hayes." Sol simply nodded back. He stepped onto the plane. The doors closed behind him. The cabin was silent. His assistant asked, This is the first time you're really boarding this plane. What are you feeling? Soul looked out the window. This flight isn't for me. It's for those who come after. Because now, when someone arrives, they won't be told, you're not on the list. The plane began its taxi for takeoff. On the cabin screen, a company-wide message appeared. Sender, Solomon Hayes. Subject, boarding pass. If one day the system fails to recognize you, stay calm. If you're standing in the right place, the system will update itself to meet you there. And every update to the system is an update to justice. The Gulf Stream lifted from the runway. Below, the terminal, the roads, the signs shrank into the distance. But something else grew. The weight of the story. Because now this wasn't just Soul's story. It was the story of everyone who had ever been left outside the door. Everyone whose success had ever been questioned. Everyone who had ever been made to feel like the other. And that flight was no longer just a destination. It was a rebirth, a vertical awakening of the corporate world. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video.